Okay, everybody, here we are back for part 3 video on vascular plants. And now we're going to look at the seed plants that are classified as angiosperms. And I think these are going to be the plants that you are the most familiar with. Okay, so let's jump into the angiosperms. So again, these are seed plants. These are the flowering plants. So you can see the whole variety of different types of flowers that we have. And there's such a variety of plants in the angiosperms is that they are considered the most successful vascular plant. And it probably has to do with the fact that of these flowers, the flower is the reproductive organ. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, again, there's such a diversity of sizes and forms and everything else, and diversity of the types of flowers. They're a pretty amazing group. The sporophyte generation, just like we saw with the gymnosperms, they're larger. They're also nutritionally independent. And just like we saw before, the gametophyte is microscopic, and that is nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte. Okay, and then we're also going to see that they're heterosporous. So again, there'll be male parts and female parts. Sometimes you need separate plants. You have a male plant, female plant. Sometimes they have the male parts and the female parts on the same plant. Okay, we're also going to see a double fertilization process of seeds within the other thing that they have are fruits. Okay. So let's first look at the characteristics. I just mentioned a few, but we'll go a little deeper into that. Okay, so the key innovation of the angiosperms and probably what's made them the most successful are the flowers. Okay, the flowers are actually used for sexual reproduction. Okay, they can be very complex. They usually have, and I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of flowers now. We're going to have a separate lecture on focusing on flowers, just like with seeds. So we'll really get into the anatomy of a flower. Okay, but for now, what I want you to know is that, again, that they are the sexually reproducing structure for the plant. And you can see that most flowers, but it could be different on different plants, but many of them have both the male and the female parts. So the female part, the whole structure is called the carpel, and that's separated into the sticky stigma at the top. And so angiosperms are also going to use pollen to deliver the sperm to the eggs. So the pollen gets stuck on the stigma. A pollen tube is going to also be produced, and it's going to digest its way down the style and make its way into the ovary. And the ovary is the rounded structure at the bottom, which can contain one or more ovules. And the ovules are the eggs. That's where the eggs are contained. Then the male portions are the stamens, and the stamens contain the filament that attaches the anther to the flower, and it's within the anther where the microsporangia are, where the pollen are being made. Okay? And so normally most flowering plants do not pollinate themselves, and what we're going to see that they're more successful than the gymnosperms, partly because their method of pollination. They've evolved a way to attract pollinators, insects, birds, sometimes even people that will be attracted to their specific flower type. And many times a flower might produce a nectar, a sweet, a sugary food for the pollinator. And so when the pollinator comes around, it picks up the pollen on its own body. And then when it flies off to another flower, then the pollen from its body gets stuck to the stigma of a different flower. So instead of having random pollination by the wind, this is actually having organisms specifically pollinate the flowers of their own species and spread their pollen to the flowers of their own species. So there's a lot less waste that occurs that way. There's a higher chance of the pollen of one flower getting to a flower of the same species. And we're going to see this in a separate unit as well. How flowers and pollinators, like insects and birds, how they've co-evolved in order to have the specific pollination situation go on. It's pretty cool. The other key innovation of the the flowering plants are both seeds and fruits. Right? So just like we saw before, once pollination occurs and allows for fertilization to occur, we're going to go look at that a little more closely in a minute, then the seeds are produced, much like we saw earlier. And so the same thing, we have the embryo inside the seed with a nutrition associated with it. That's called the endosperm. And then the seed coat to protect it on the outside. Okay, so endosperm is what nourishes the embryo inside of the seed. Once, before that happens though, the seed, once it's gotten fertilized, or the egg, once it's gotten fertilized and the seed is developing, then also a fleshy fruit is developed around it. Okay, these are structures that develop from the ovary and from the walls of the ovary. And this is a structure that helps with dispersal because they're brightly colored and they're fleshy and they contain nutrition and they're good. And so we like to eat fruit. Lots of different organisms like to eat fruit. And what happens is many times either the seeds get dislodged from the fruit and dispersed away from the plant as a organism carries the fruit away. Also, once the fruit is eaten, the seeds will travel through the digestive tract of whatever organism is eating it and then deposit the seed somewhere else. So a lot of times what we'll see is like this cherry at the bottom, and think of really thick seeds like peaches on the inside of a peach and other stone fruits. Those seed coats are really, really thick. So it's hard to, so it protects it so that angiosperms can really colonate areas where that can be very dry. So these seeds are greatly protected. But sometimes in order to germinate, they have to pass through the digestive system of an animal so that the digestive acids break down the seed coat. And then again, the animal can't digest the seed itself, but it breaks down the seed coat as it passes through, and it comes out the other end in a pile of feces, and that's a pile of fertilizer for that seed, and so you can get germination. So it really can disperse seeds away from the parent plants and colonize new areas. Right? Also, I mentioned this before when we talked about the gymnosperms and more specifically the netophytes. The angiosperms also now contain in their xylem cells referred to as vessel elements. So these are a little bit more efficient in transferring water throughout the plant. And then again, sieve tube elements are cells associated with the phloem, and these are the sugar conducting cells. So as the leaves are photosynthesizing and making sugar, making glucose, then it gets distributed around the plant and mainly down to the roots where it gets stored as starch, right? And you like to eat starch. You like to eat carrots and potatoes and things like that. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so let's go. So the angiosperms, they can be broken up into two main groups, and those are referred to as the monocots and the dicots. And then within each of those groups, there are different phyla and families and things like that. And again, we're going to worry about the classification at the end of the semester. But let's look at the characteristics between a monocot and a dicot. Monocot stands for monocotyledon, okay? And a cotyledon is the embryonic seed leaf. Okay, and so we'll get to that in a minute, and because there's several characteristics of a monocot, and it makes it easy to identify a monocot when you look at a plant. Okay, so one of the things about a monocot is when you look at the flower petals, they're arranged in threes. So there will either be 3 flower petals, or there might be 6 or 9. So if you look at this flower down here, and you count the petals on the outer edge, the larger ones, there are 6 of those. And even toward the inside, there are 3 of those. So an arrangement of threes. The veins that go through the leaves, again, the vascular tissue, they are parallel. So think of grasses, think of palms, things like that. You can always see the parallel kind of lines. That's the vascular tissue through the leaf. Okay. The next thing are the, I'll show you vascular bundles in a minute. Let me talk about seeds. So the seed on the inside, if you cut open the seed, you'll see the embryo inside of there, and the embryo produces a single embryonic leaf, and that's called a cotyledon. So there's one of those. So one, the term we use for one is mono. Mono means one. So that's why these are called monocotyledons, or monocots for short. Okay. And then of course, just like we saw before, there's endosperm, which is the nutritive tissue. So that's what nourishes the embryo when it's ready to germinate and grow. Okay. Another characteristic of monocots is when you look at their roots, they're very fibrous. They have very scattered branched roots that penetrate into the soil. So they're fibrous roots. And then when you cut through the stem of a monocot, the arrangement of the xylem and the phloem is scattered. Okay, and so that's what we see in this picture here. You see all of those little circles inside of there. Those are the cross section of the vessel elements and the sieve tube cells, and they're just kind of scattered all around. Okay, you're going to see something different now in the dicots, and you can remember these things: flower parts, leaf venation, vascular bundles, roots, seeds, and you can just compare the monocots and dicots 1-to-1 like that. So monocots, things that you're familiar with, I mentioned palm trees, grass, irises, lilies, orchids, things like onions. Those are all monocots. Okay, so that brings us to the dicots. Again, we're going to look at flowers, leaf venation, vascular bundles, roots, seeds. So in the flowers, their flower parts are separated into 4s or 5s. So if you count the petals around these plants, you're going to see either groups of or multiples of 4s or multiples of 5s. So the one at the top there, I count 5 petals. The yellow one, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13, 14, 15. I count 15. That's a group of 5. Okay, so again, very easy if you see flowers on the plants. If you can count groups of 3s, then you've got a monocot. If you count 4s or 5s, then you've got a dicot. Also, the leaf pattern, the venation of the leaf pattern is in a net. And here's the close-up of that leaf. So instead of seeing those parallel lines that you saw in the monocot, you see the branching veins coming out, and then even more branching and more branching. So it's kind of in a net-like pattern. Since we're zoomed in here, if we look at the seeds, so the embryonic seed leaf we said is a cotyledon. Well, there are 2 inside of the dicots, because di means 2, cot means cotyledon, so there are 2 cotyledons. So these are the dicotyledons. Okay. The vascular bundles are arranged in a circle. So you can see much more organized pattern. So instead of that scattered pattern all around, so these are the purple stained areas. That's the xylem and the phloem. That's arranged like that. And then also the roots, it's instead of that fibrous roots that come out, there's some fibrous roots, but there's a main taproot that grows deep down into the soil. If anybody out there is like me and I pull mustard plants in the spring because they're very invasive, you get this long taproot and you got to pull that whole thing out so that the plant doesn't grow again. Alrighty, so again, make sure you know the characteristics of monocots and dicots, and again, you can just compare them 1 to 1. Okay, we got to look at the life cycle. We got to do it. This is the last life cycle that you'll get. The plant life cycle of a flowering plant. Again, the sporophyte generation, just like in the gymnosperms, it's larger. And these are nutritionally independent from the gametophyte. But the gametophytes are dependent on the sporophytes, and the gametophyte is microscopic, like we saw before. So we're still going to see megaspores and microspores, and that's going to occur. The sexual reproduction is going to occur within the flowers. The flowers are the sexually reproducing organs. And now we're going to see something called double fertilization. So this will be easier to explain as we go around the cycle. So if we start at the bottom with the big flower, you see the number 1. So the mature sporophytes, they will produce the flower, the sexual reproductive organ of the angiosperms. And so again, it has all those parts that I referred to before. Again, we're going to go over that more specifically in another lecture. But if you look at the male portion, again, that's the stamen, and the top of the stamen is called the anther. It's within the anther that the microsporophytes are located. Okay, the microsporangia are inside there making the microsporophytes. Okay, on the female portion, down in the carpel at the ovary at the bottom, that's where the megasporophyte is located, and the megasporocytes undergo the meiosis, and they form the haploid megaspores. Okay, all of this occurs. The megasporocyte, another word for that, is the ovary. Okay, so again, those divide by meiosis. Okay, so within the anther, the male portion, meiosis is occurring, and the microspores are produced and form the pollen grains. In the female side, the megaspores being produced, that's the egg. And again, same like before, 4 haploid cells are produced, but all of the machinery and the nutrition goes into one of the megaspores, so you get 1 functional egg. So again, pollination occurs. Pollination now is occurring with something from the animal kingdom that is depositing the pollen. Yeah, it could happen by wind, but mostly it happens through insects and birds. They are co-evolved in order to help with the pollination, which we'll go over that in more detail later as well. So the pollination then is when the pollen gets stuck to the sticky stigma at the end of the female portion, and then the pollen grows its pollen tube, and now the pollen with the pollen tube is the mature male gametophyte. So again, the pollen tube grows down the female portion there and gets to the embryo sac inside of the female portion, and that's where the exchange of the nucleus from the pollen from the sperm. Sperm enters the egg, and then we get fertilization. Okay, and here's where the double fertilization comes from. So look at number 6 there. It says the pollen tube grows through the female tissue to deposit 2 sperm cells into the embryo sac. Okay, the embryo sac is the mature female gametophyte. So 2 sperm cells enter in there. Okay, one fertilizes the egg, so that's going to produce the zygote. Another fertilizes, you see the 2 polar nuclei, so 2 other cells. And so each of those are haploid. So there's 2 of those that are haploid. And then the sperm fertilizes those and it becomes a triploid. That's what produces the endosperm. That's the nutritious portion and something that's unique to the angiosperms. Okay, so it's actually some of the sperm material has to actually fertilize the polar nuclei, these separate cells, in order to produce the nutritive portion. And that's partly then what really helps provide nutrient to the embryo, right? And then the outer portion of the ovule will develop into the fleshy fruit. And so now the seed is not only protected, or I'm sorry, the embryo is not only protected by the seed coat, that's the seed itself, but then the fruit develops around the outside of that. And so again, the seed can get distributed through the fruit, and then when it lands in a appropriate environment, then we get germination and we start all over again. So that's the alternation of generations for the angiosperm. So again, make sure that you can just reproduce and discuss this cycle. And don't forget now the double fertilization that occurs here. All right, that does it for our vascular plants. So again, the next videos that will occur, the next lessons will focus more on the seeds and the flowers. Okay, and we might look a little bit closer at stems and roots, the other structures, but we're mainly going to focus on seeds and flowers. All right, thanks guys.